In the first chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber, we meet a stone and a magical plant. Heavenly dew rolls off the back of the stone onto the plant, causing the plant to come to life as a woman. It seems that this is the pre-mortal existence of Lin Daiyu. Anyway, in this passage, the plant swears to repay the favor that the stone gave her by going with him to the earth when he becomes human. The stone says, 但把我一生所有的眼泪还他，也还得过了, which means if I use every tear I shed as a person to repay him, I will surely settle the debt. Well, that's a pretty crazy way to start a classical story, right? Anyway, for our purposes today, we're not going to look so much at the mythology and all the mystery behind the story and all of that stuff. No, we're just going to look at the grammatical construction that she just used. That would be this character right here, ba. The ba construction comes up over and over again in modern Chinese texts, and it can be really difficult for foreigners to understand. So basically, the idea behind the ba construction is that you can take the object and stick it in front of the verb, which lets you stick other stuff behind the verb. Now, I really need to emphasize that the ba construction at heart is a rhetorical grammatical construction. In other words, it's used usually because you want to emphasize a certain thing in the sentence. You can figure out different ways to say every single one of these sentences that we're going to be looking at. Now, you might remember that I talked a little while ago about the topic comment sentence structure, right? Well, these ba sentences work on the same general theory. So for whatever reason, when you're making up your sentence, you want to stick the object up near the front of the sentence for whatever rhetorical effect it is you're thinking of. But let's look at an example first. Now, here's a really basic example. 我把作业写完了, or I finished writing my homework. In this sentence, 我 is the subject of the sentence. In other words, this isn't a passive sentence. 作业 is the object, and notice that it is in front of the verb 写. 把 serves as an object marker here. It shows that the thing behind it is the object. Now, the other thing to know is that the verb isn't just 写, it's 写完, and the 完 is what we call a verb complement. Chinese just absolutely loves verb complements, and verb complements are not really that easy to understand if you're new to learning the language. But this is stuff that you hear all the time once you've heard the language a lot. For example, 说话 instead of just 说, or 吃饭 instead of just 吃, or 睡觉 instead of just 睡. Now, normally I wouldn't make such a big deal about this, except that you absolutely need to have a verb complement in every single one of these sentences. In fact, let's look at some of the rules of the ba construction. Okay, the first thing you need to have is an object that is of definite reference, just as it says here in Chinese, a comprehensive grammar. In other words, the sentence 他把一个电视机弄坏了 is incorrect because we don't know which television he broke. If you said instead 他把我们家的电视机弄坏了, or he broke our family television, the sentence would be fine since the object is definite. But of course, since we're talking about language here, there are always exceptions to the rule. And you have to remember that anytime you're studying language. There will always be exceptions to every single rule that you can think of. Sometimes the exceptions will be obvious, sometimes they will be not so obvious. By the way, I think that this is one of the reasons why generative AI has such a difficult time with language and with constructing language that sounds natural. It's because there are certain sayings and different ways we emphasize things and stuff like that that will be natural if you grew up in a certain environment, but if you're just a robot, you don't know about any of that. All you know is the book rules. Anyway, with the ba construction, if you've got a modal verb or what we can call a helping verb, you can have an indefinite object, not just a definite object. So you can say 你可以把字写得好一点吗? Or could you write a little bit more nicely? Notice that 字, or characters, is a very general and indefinite noun. I'm talking about your writing in general, not like these specific characters you wrote. But the key here is the verb 可以, which is a modal verb or a helping verb. Here it means could you. But you can't say 你把字写错了, or you wrote incorrectly, because in this sentence you don't have that modal verb. Instead, you need to say 你把这个字写错了, or you wrote this particular character wrong. So here you have 谁都应该把书放回原位, or everybody should put the books back where they belong. Again, 书 is indefinite. We're talking about the books in general that everybody took out. But you could not say 你们把书放回原位, or you guys put the books back, because here the object is indefinite. Instead, you need to say something like 你们把你们的书放回原位, or you guys put your books back where they belong. So here the object is 你们的书, the books you guys took out, which of course is a definite object. But is that really the case? Honestly, I'm not entirely convinced. I feel like I've actually heard indefinite objects used in the ba construction without a modal verb. So I've got to defer to any native speakers who might be watching this for what your opinion is on the subject, if you have any sort of examples or something like that. Anyway, we've got 2 more rules to look at. The second rule that I mentioned before is that you need to have that pesky verb complement. So you can't say 他把那个电视机送 or he gave the television set. It just makes no sense. Instead, you would need to say something like 他把那个电视机送出去了. He gave the television set away. That 出去了 at the end serves as the verb complement. You can think of it as completing the verb, or at least making it so that the verb isn't so lonely. Anyway, I know that I just talked about the verb complement. Let's talk about it again. So it's like a whole bunch of other things in Chinese, like the topic common sentence construction or the ba construction or things like classifiers. The verb complement is one of those things that makes Chinese Chinese. It's also one of the common stumbling blocks that foreigners run across because it just doesn't exist this way in other languages. And I do include East Asian languages in that mix. So while objects and verb complements are absolutely a thing in like Japanese and Korean, it doesn't work like it does in Chinese, where you have to have a generic verb complement to go along with the verb so the verb isn't lonely, or however we want to think about it. But when you go to the Chinese dialects, including the ones that you people tell me are different languages like Cantonese and Taiwanese Hokkien and Wu and so on, you see the verb complements. So that's why they're kind of dialects and not completely separate languages. Anyway, it's pretty interesting when you think about it. Now, the verb complement can be all sorts of things. For example, in 大夫把他的病治好了, or the doctor cured his illness, 好了 is a verb complement that tells us the result of the action. The illness was completely cured. In 母亲把孩子搂在怀里, or mother took the child in her arms, 在怀里 is a locational complement. It tells us where the mother was holding the child. In 他把信转交给他, or he passed the letter on to her, 给他 indicates an indirect object. He gave the letter to her. And in 他把那几个生词默写了好几遍, or he wrote the new words from memory many times, the 好几遍 tells us how frequently he wrote the words. So those sentences show some of the reasons why you would want to use the ba construction. When you've got a whole ton of stuff to stick at the end of the sentence, it's helpful to get that object out in front to give yourself some room at the back. And it helps you emphasize the thing that you really want emphasized in your sentence. So we could take that last sentence and change it around a little bit depending upon what we wanted to emphasize. You could say 他默写了那几个生词好几遍. He wrote those new words from memory several times, and it would be perfectly fine. But of course, the emphasis here seems to be on 默写, or the fact that he wrote them from memory. If you want to go the topic comment route, you could say 那几个生词他默写了好几遍. He wrote those new words from memory several times. In this case, you would put even more emphasis on those few characters. Now, in my experience, you usually want to go instead for the topic comment structure when you've already been talking about that thing in the course of your conversation. So for example, if we're talking about this guy and we're talking about his homework already, and you asked me, hey, what was he doing to memorize those characters? I would want to stick the 那几个生词, those characters, at the beginning of my sentence to respond to you. At least to me, that feels a lot more natural in that kind of conversational situation than using the ba construction. Anyway, the third rule is the easiest to understand. The main verb has to be an action verb. You can't say 他把这件事知道了, or he came to know this thing, because 知道, or to know, is not an action verb. You need an action verb like in 弟弟把花瓶打破了, or a younger brother broke the vase. 打破, or break, is clearly an action verb. However, there are some verbs that kind of work as action verbs. For example, 别把我的电话号码忘了, or don't forget my telephone number. 忘了 means to forget, but in this case, it is actually an action verb. And that's because, well, that's just because it's just how it works, right? It's one of those Chinese things. This is the way the language is. It just works that way. And it's hard to explain because it's the sort of thing that you really need to get a feel for through constant repetition. Anyways, now we can go back and take a look at that Lin Daiyu example to see if she follows the rules. So again, Lin Daiyu swore to herself, 但把我一生所有的眼泪还他，也还得过了, or if I use every tear I shed as a person to repay him, I will surely settle the debt. The object here is 眼泪, tears, which is pretty general and indefinite by itself. However, that noun 眼泪 is modified by a pretty big phrase, 我一生所有的眼泪, or every single tear I shed in my entire life, which is obviously a definite object. And that means it passes the first criteria. Now, second, we need a verb with a complement or with an object. And here we have an object, 还他, or returned it to him, and so that passes as well. And third, the verb has to be an action verb. Once again, the verb 还, or to return something, is an action verb. And so this sentence passes the test. Okay, if you're wondering about the history of the ba construction, and I was when I was making this video, you're going to get kind of confused. It doesn't really exist in classical Chinese. In fact, the oldest examples of it that I could find came from books from the 16th century like Shioji or Journey to the West. Seriously, there are so many examples of this construction in Shioji that it's not even funny. And the reason why is because the book was written in colloquial language rather than in the stiff and formal classical Chinese language. Of course, this is one reason why Shioji, Honglou-Meng, and the other classical novels were so popular. It's because ordinary people could easily read them and understand them. Now, if you're wondering where the construction comes from, you have to understand that the word ba originally meant to pick something up with the hand, like this. That's actually a pretty easy way to think about the construction if you get confused. In fact, you can go back through those examples and pretend that ba is a verb meaning to pick up, and it will make sense. Any good Chinese dictionary will have to hold or to grasp as the first definition for the word ba. You can still see it in modern words like ba wo, which means to grasp or seize, and it can also mean to grasp or understand in a figurative sense. Ba is also a commonly used classifier for a handful of an object or for objects that can be held in the hand. And yeah, it is confusing, especially at first when you've got like a single character that's always pronounced the same way that has so many different meanings, but it's the same character, right? So when I started learning Chinese, I thought, oh, this will be interesting, and like every character is going to have like one set meaning for one set thing. Ha ha ha. No. Now, the only real way to solve this problem, and the only real way to understand such a difficult and unusual grammatical construction at all, is to spend some time exposing yourself to native media. The more that you hear this in context, the easier it will be for you to get a feeling for how it is used and exactly what it means. You have to listen kind of carefully, but you can find examples of these ba sentences all over Chinese TV shows. And it's a really good way to develop a natural feel for how these sentences are actually used in real life. Okay, so again, my advice is that you need to spend some of your time looking for these constructions in the wild. In other words, like do whatever you can to get a hold of, I don't know, like podcasts or like movies or TV shows or something, whether through licit or illicit means. Watch them, try to understand what you're watching, and then take those sentences and turn them into cards for Anki or whatever software it is you want to use. Remember, though, that you're going to have a difficult time learning and understanding grammar in any language if you only try to learn it in the abstract. It's going to be very difficult. It's much easier to first learn the rule, to then look at like the sentence, to spend time tearing it apart, figure out how it works, and then keep looking for other examples, and then stick it into Anki. You don't want to do this thing that I see people do all the time where you go download the deck and stick it in, and you're like, how come I don't understand what's going on, right? It doesn't work the way you think it is, right? You also don't want to spend like hours and hours trying to memorize the rule and learn it and memorize all the crazy exceptions because you're going to go insane. After all, you have to realize that your goal with these languages needs to be the ability to use the grammar naturally and not your ability to memorize a rule book.